Hi, in this class, we're going to see how to define and use schemas in a Meteor application, and also what problems we might have in not using them. So here, I already have the Meteor application running on my machine, and if you came back to our code, you can see that here in the main.js file, we are using this Meteor.startup to define a function that we run every time that the Meteor app starts. And here, we are checking if we don't have any documents in our wallets collection. In that case, we are inserting a new one. And we are using balance, currency, and created at. And here, as you can see, I'm using 0 as default. And for the currency, I'm using USD. But what if I change it to, let's say, currency balance? And here, instead of USD, US dollars. So now, let's come back to our database and see what happened. And here we should have more than one document right now. Okay, and as you can see, this one was the last document that we inserted. And we are using currency balance instead of balance, and for the currency we are using US dollars instead of USD. And that's because, as we have seen, MongoDB is a schemaless database, which means that we don't need to use the same structure, but we can fix that using schemas. And here, for example, to enforce the use of balance as the field name and to enforce a standard value for the currency, we could validate this data against a schema before inserting it into the database. And in Meteor, the preeminent package that we have to do this is this one called Simple Schema. And Simple Schema is an NPM package that, as the name suggests, is a very simple way to define a schema. And we can install this in our application by running Meteor npm install simple schema. So let's do this. So here, the first thing I want to do is import my simple schema from simple schema and create my first schema here. Let's say wallet schema. And then I need to create a new instance of simple schema. And here I have basically two ways to define the fields that I want to create for that schema. I have the shorthand definition, which is basically the name of the field and its type. So for example, currency and balance should be a number, and created at, which will be a date. And if you came back to the documentations, you can see that here we have all the types that we can define for our schema. For example, we can define a string, a number, this custom integer number, a boolean, an object, an array, or any custom or built-in class. For example, date. So here, let's define on this way. And to validate this data against this schema, we can call our schema and using the function .validate. Okay, so now, if this data is not a valid data, this validate method will throw an error and this function will not be called, the insert method. So if the app reaches this line, 25, it means that our data is valid. So let's remove all the data that we have here in our database. Okay. And now let's change it to 25. Okay. Now, as you can see, we have an error here. And the error is that the current balance is not allowed by the schema. And also here, you can see that we have basically two errors. The current balance is not allowed by the schema, and the balance is required. It's because we are creating a field here which is not defined in our schema, so it will throw an error. And also the balance value is not defined here. So if you change it to balance, okay, now we should be able to see this data in our database here. And the second way that we have to define our schema is basically using a longhand definition, where instead of using the type here directly, we're going to use an object and then define a type here. And this way, we can also define some additional rules. For example, we can define a minimal value for the balance, which will be 0. And here we can define the type string. And for the currents, we can define some allowed values. For example, USD and euros. So that way, every time that we type something different than USD or euros, we're gonna receive an error. So let's check here. Okay, so now as you can see, US dollar is not allowed value. And if you change it to euros using this pattern, okay, now as you can see, we have this data here. And you can also define some default values here for each field. For example, this one I can define the default value of 0. And for this one, I can define USD. Okay, so let's remove these two fields right now and see what happens. Okay, so now as you can see, we're getting an error that balance is required and currency is required. And that's because this default value will not run automatically. We need to use another method of simple schema. If you came back to the documentation here and search for default value, you can see that in order to set this default value, we need to use something called clean. So we need to call this clean before, and this clean will clean the values that are not allowed in the schema and also will set the default values. So let's try. So now Let me clean this terminal. And here I can use, for example, wallet schema.clean. And then I need to pass the wallet data. And here I will have a new value, for example, clean wallet. And then I need to use this clean wallet to validate the data and also to insert. So let's see. Okay, and now if you check your database, okay, let me clean the database and run again to see. Okay, let's change something in our code. Let's remove this one. Okay, so now as you can see, we have the balance value set to 0 and the currency to USD. Okay. Now, let's come back to the documentation here. And as you can see, besides the string, number, boolean, we can use objects, arrays, simple schemas and sub-schemas. And also we can use this one-off option here to work with multiple schemas. But now let's see how we can use an array of objects and define a simple schema for each object inside this array. So let's come back to our code. And here, let's say that instead of using the balance and the value and the currency here, we want to define multiple balance, multiple values for multiple currencies. So in that way, we can use, for example, this structure here called currencies. And then inside the currencies, we're going to receive an array. And inside this array, let's say that we are going to send an object where we can define the balance and the currency. Okay. And let's say that we have two different objects here. So let's say $5 and 0 euros. Okay. Okay. Okay, it should work because we are saying this value and this value is not mapped here. So the clean option here will just remove this one. But let me just comment here for now and using the wallet data here. Okay, and then I need to call the wallet schema with the wallet data as well. Okay, now we should get an error. Okay, perfect. And now let's work on this schema here. So in this case, we can use, for example, a new type here, a new field here, and define the type as an array. Okay. And here we can define a new simple schema for this object here. So let's use currency schema. And here, let's copy these two fields. Okay, now here we can say that the currencies has a type of currency schema. So here we're basically saying to the simple schema that the currency will be an array, and each item of this array will be an object of the type currency schema. Okay, so now let me clean this terminal and let me change here for this one. Okay, and now we'll get an error that the position number 1 of the array, the currency value, has a value that's not allowed, which is correct, because if you came here to the schema, we can see that we just have an USD as an allowed value. So it's working. So now let's try again, changing this to euros as well. But before, let me clean the database. Okay, now it should work. Okay, and now as you can see, I have a currencies array here, and then I have the two items here. The first one with the USD with the balance equals to 5, and the second one for euros, which is 0. Okay. Now let me return it to our original code here. Let me remove this currency schema and put these two fields here. Okay, now I can remove this one and using the clean wallet data again. Okay, and this is basically how you can use in schema. And I recommend you to go to the documentation here. You can see that we have a lot of examples here, but the most common ones are these ones that I show you in this example here. And we can use these schemas to validate any kind of data. A common place that we can put in the schema, for example, is inside our Meteor methods. For example, here, instead of checking each value here, we can define a schema, and this schema will handle all this validation that we need. So let's create a new schema here to validate our data when insert a new transaction here. So and here I need is transferring, which will be a boolean. A source wallet, which is a string, and a destination wallet. And also the amount. And here I can remove these checks here. So here I can define another rule here for my destination wallet, which will be the optional. And by default, all the fields inside the simple schema are mandatory, but if we define an option equals true, the field will become optional. So, and here we can use this is transferring to define if it's an option or not. Because if you were transferring money, then the destination wallet would be mandatory. Otherwise, it will be optional. So now we can remove this here. And we can also define a minimum value to our amount to be 0. Okay. And now we need to call the clean and the validate. So here you can call this like props or arguments. And then we need to validate the arguments against our schema. And here we have the clean arguments. Okay, and you can remove this check here. Okay, so now let's reset our database again. And I'm gonna include that validation that we had here. Okay, and now let's try to transfer some money here and send an invalid data. For example, and here you can send, for example, to the is transferring a string, let's say 1. Okay, and now let's see what happened here. I guess that we will need to change this line over here. And we should be able to see the error message now on error response.details. Okay, I need to get this transferring for the arguments. And here I need to use arguments as well. Okay. And let me see what I'm getting in this error response here. Okay, I am getting an undefined here. And if you come back to the documentation of simple schema, you can see here that we have a way to customize the error message. Okay, so here you can see that you can use this function to define a new type of error. And for the Meteor app, it says that in order to ensure that the error details are sent back to the client, we can use this method here as well. So let's try to do this. And here I can define inside my server file, I'm gonna create a new folder here called infra. And then I'm gonna create a new file here, custom error.js. Okay, and here basically I'm transforming the error that I'm getting from the simple schema into a Meteor error. And I'm defining the details here, and I'm returning that error. So now we can call this here. Okay, and now we are getting the details error here. And as you can see, it's an array, and inside this array, we have the message. So here, a for each in the details array. So a response.details, and these details can be undefined. So for each, and here we're gonna receive an error. And inside this error, we're gonna need to use the message. And now I can remove these two lines here. Okay, so now as you can see, its transfer must be of type boolean, and if I change it to it's transferred again, and now let's say remove the source wallet ID. Source wallet ID is required. And I believe that this is also wrong, because the destination wallet should be optional if we are not transferring money. And here you can also define the minimum value of 1 to the amount. Okay, so now, as you can see, we were able to remove all those validations with just this simple schema here. In the next lesson, we'll see some details on how the DDP protocol works that you should take into account when defining the structure of your data in MongoDB. Then, we'll see another library that will help us to automatically clean the data and automatically do the validation whenever we change something in our database. So, see you there.